Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner.
Chapter 12. The Passes of Viergnola. Fletch pushed through the heavy snow. The wind whipped at his cloak, pulling it away from his body, out to the side, like a banner. His jaw was set hard against the cold, as he held a torch high over his head. His other paw held the graceful sword swan. The flickering flame sometimes sent a ruddy flash of light through the lithium crystal set within the pommel of the curved blade, but it was always doused quickly by a cold, white radiance. Fletch breathed in and out rhythmically, focusing the light through Swan's crystal. Almost every lightcraft technique required some sort of gesture to effectively perform them. Thankfully, whomever developed this technique had the good sense to make it as easy as breathing. Techniques usually affected the world about you, focusing the light around or through objects. But this technique focused inward, and to Fletch's eyes, the world took on an unnatural shape. It was unclear if the technique actually affected his eyes, compressing the invisible spectrum, or if it merely created a stronger link between his nose and optic nerves. Either way, the scent he followed was as clear to his eyes as it was to his nose. Under the influence of the technique, Fletch's whole world seemed to shimmer in innumerable variations of scent trails. Scents overlapping, scents rising and billowing, brushing against trees, lingering on the snow, or being picked up and carried off on the wind to land elsewhere. Fletch had spent a long time studying Fate's scent before he ventured out into the night, memorizing the swirling patterns created by the technique. He would not lose her. Fletch stopped at the crest of a hill. The wind had taken her scent and scattered it far, mingling it with earth, snow, and trees. The pattern was obscured, fading, fleeting. Fletch waited patiently, watching the patterns fade. His memory cast back to a time when Fate had pressed him to teach her how to use the tracking technique. Fletch had been pleased. He felt everyone should have a good notion of how to navigate the world. Fate had teased him, theorizing about what shape his scent might form. However, as soon as Fate had managed the technique, she had become violently ill, as the swirl of the world-shifting sensation and heightened smell had overwhelmed her, and by consequence had overturned her stomach in a spectacular fashion. Fletch had felt slightly guilty after that. He had failed to warn Fate that most illuminating scent trails weren't exactly flattering to the nose. After she had recovered from her bout of retching, Fate seemed less enthusiastic about the technique. To use her words, she was happy to be just a little lost, if the price to pay for adept navigation was so nauseating. Fletch grinned satisfactorily as Fate's scent pattern suddenly became brilliantly clear. It was so odd how a memory could spark clarity. He pushed on through the snow, following. "Hold!" Fletch called out over the wind to Edek and Prince Felix. "Her trail stops here. Spread out and stay on guard." Edek and Felix flanked outward from where Fletch stood, a hillside blanketed in snow and under the unblinking gaze of the late moon. Fletch let his held technique go. He felt slightly lightheaded as the world and his breathing returned to normality. Swan cooled to her normal, silvered beauty as the light faded from her crystalline jewel. Fletch moved forward cautiously. The snow had been falling steadily for the last hour, and he wanted to be certain he did not overlook anything in the paltry light cast by the wind-ravaged torch. He stopped suddenly. Before him a hunched form lay, covered in a blanket of snow. Fletch reached out with the point of his sword and pushed against the ice-riddled pelt of a dead wolf. As the wolf turned over, an outline of a white furred body could be seen amidst the forest of shaggy brown fur. "Here, to me!" Fletch called out to his companions. Each made for him quickly. Edek in his eagerness created a billowing snowstorm in his wake. Fletch handed his lit torch to Prince Felix when he arrived and knelt in the snow by the dead wolf. He grabbed the heavy paw of the wolf and forced it backwards. It was stiff with cold and in death's grip, but he persisted until the torchlight brushed upon Fate's face. Frost coated her eyelashes, and her lips were pale blue. Fletch reached out, softly brushing flakes of snow from her cheeks, and then gently placed his paw upon her neck. Flutter, flutter, flutter. The faint flicker of a pulse could be felt. Fletch released a weighty breath that rose in a cloud of feathered vapor, followed by a shaky inhale and a hearty sniff. Taking his cloak from around his neck, Fletch placed it upon the ground. He reached forward and gently took hold of Fate, pulling her from the wolf's embrace. He removed the swords she cradled to her chest and handed them over his shoulder to Felix. Fletch crossed Fate's arms before her and bundled her tightly within the cloak. Then, taking her close to his chest, he stood. Fletch looked Prince Felix in the eye and said, "Lead us back." Felix nodded stiffly and turned on his heel, holding the torches high above him, lighting the way. Fletch took a few labored steps, following the torchlight. Then from behind him came the sounds of savage ripping, tearing, shredding, snarling, the sounds of wanton destruction. Fletch grimaced. "Edek, leave it. The living have need of you now." After a cacophonous crash of trees breaking from something heavy being violently thrown, Edek materialized out of the darkness, plowing through the heavy snow. The drake's golden eyes blazed with a fury that would quell the bravest warrior, but his temper seemed to evaporate as he looked down upon Fate. Edek's large head and nostrils came close to hover over her inert body. A blast of warm breath, as hot as a metal forge's bellows, washed over the two Lightbearers, making their fur dance. Edek blinked once, and he stared worriedly at Fletch. The fox could only stare back. His face was rigid, set in a tight frown. Fletch turned, and Edek took up pace next to him, watching and ready if the fox's step should falter to the deep snow. Silently, they followed Felix's beckoning flame as they worked their way back up icy Viergnola. Fate slowly came to the realization that she was laying on her back. Her thoughts were incredibly sluggish, but her body was blissfully warm. For a moment, she just listened. The faint sound of breathing was all she could hear. She opened her eyes. A candle flickered and fluttered in a small draught. Muddy, indistinct shadows danced upon a roof of rock. She was in a cave. Not the same shelter from before. This one was different, much larger. Lifting her head, she felt a weight upon her chest. She looked down. Her jacket had been laid across her like a blanket. Underneath, her chest and ribs had been wrapped tightly with linen bandages, and upon them laid her bracelet, inlaid with its lithium crystal. She took the crystal in her paw and felt a lingering sensation of light residing within it. Fate looked to the side, where she saw Fletch stretched out upon the floor, propped against the bundle of his gear. His brunette paws lay across his chest, which rose and fell softly, lost in the throes of a deep, exhausted sleep. That seemed to explain the crystal. Fletch must have attended to her, using a healing technique. However, his aptitude with the finer points of water technique had never been as keen as hers, and his efforts always left him spent. She smiled gratefully. Fletch's posture looked uncomfortable. His head sagged upon his chest, and his mouth hung slightly open, but Fate dared not touch him for fear it might wake him. From her other side came a hard scraping noise. She turned her head to look. What at first appeared to be a shifting rock turned out to be the head of Edek, revealing from the shadows. "I failed you," Edek said. His voice was deep and husky, a tone unlike anything Fate had ever heard before from the drake. "I failed both of you." "No," Fate said in a quieting manner. "I'm sorry." "Shush," Fate said, reaching out to touch the huge snout of Edek, quieting him. "You found me." She stroked his scaly nose in a grateful manner, a smile breaking across her face. "Ah, that stings." She flinched slightly, touching her tender lip with her paw. It was split open where the wolf had struck her. She looked up questioningly at Edek. "Well?" "The true mark of a warrior," Edek commented. "That bad? I really should tutor Fletch a little better." Fate lifted herself to her elbows. "Oh!" she cried quietly, clutching at the sudden sharp pain from her tightly wrapped side. "He definitely needs more training." She winced and closed her eyes. When the pain subsided, Fate looked around the dimly lit cave. The only light was the small candle burning between herself and Fletch. The cave was large and completely enclosed from the elements. At the far end, presumably the entrance, a light came from an occluded watchfire which threw the shadowed outline of Prince Felix upon the wall. "Can you help me up?" Fate asked, pushing her jacket and blankets away and looking up at Edek. No, don't wake them. I just need to relieve myself." Edek's head jerked towards a nook at the back of the cave, then came to lower over Fate. She took hold of the bony scales that protruded from his head, and he easily lifted her into the air. Fate struggled to find her feet and held tight to the drake. After a few unsteady wobbles, Edek slowly twisted his long neck around, guiding Fate as she hobbled along, trying to master her shaky legs. When they reached the wall of the cave, she let go of Edek and pressed against the stone, then maneuvered down the wall to the excluded nook. She reappeared shortly and returned to the awaiting Edek, who once again guided her with painful slowness back to her bundle of blankets. Fate was panting slightly as Edek lowered her back to the ground. "Thank you," Fate said, breathing hard through a sharp pain. The drake opened his mouth to speak, but Fate quickly squeezed the jaws together with her arms and added, "And I forbid you from apologizing." She held him tight for a moment, then let him go from her embrace. She looked at him in the flickering light of the candle. It made his huge eyes dance with golden starlight. "You did nothing wrong, Edek." Edek gave her a stern look, but snorted in a defeated way. "Attaboy," Fate said, scratching the soft tissue at the back of Edek's jaw. The drake allowed it for a moment, then lifted his head away. Fate laid back down carefully, arranging herself painfully upon the stone floor. She shifted, trying to find a position that did not set her side alight with pain. After a long while of squirming, such a thing did not seem to exist, so she gave up. Gritting her teeth against the throbbing in her side, Fate stole a glance at Fletch. He was still arranged in his awkward hunched position, fast asleep. Fate grinned, making her busted lips sting. She explored the cut with her tongue and sighed, looking at Fletch. "Old dog, new tricks," she said mournfully. She closed her eyes. She felt the heavy weight of Edek's head slide a little closer to her, accompanied by a rasping of his scales. Gradually, she fell into much-needed sleep, listening to the sounds of deep, rhythmic breathing and the whispers of the candle. When Fate woke again, she could tell morning had come. The candle beside her was but a stumpy pile of melted wax. A cold blue light reached into the depths of the cave, yet it was not entirely successful at chasing all the lingering shadows from rocky nooks and craggy corners. Fate squinted against the bright light spilling from the entrance, where the dark silhouettes of Fletch and Felix spoke in soft voices. A stifled moan escaped Fate as she sat up and pushed the blankets from herself. She felt so weak. Even the small effort of sitting up had left her hunched over, panting. Soreness coursed through her body and limbs. Worst of all was her chest. It ached as if a boulder had been sitting on it the entire night. For a mercy, the once terrible sharp stabbing pains in her ribs had been replaced with a dull throb. The soft voices had stilled, and the clink of a wooden spoon against a bowl drew Fate's attention. A darkened outline knelt next to a small cook fire, their details lost to the blinding light that poured forth from the frozen portal that was the mouth of the cave. The shadow form rose to its feet and approached. Fate squinted upwards. Fletch's angular face and strong jaw came into view as his shadow fell upon her. "How are you doing?" Fletch asked, kneeling beside her and offering her a wooden bowl that was steaming. Prince Felix had followed and stood behind Fletch, looking worriedly down at her. Fate noticed he was holding tightly to the blue scabbarded blade she had taken from the dark wolf. "I hurt," Fate said, taking the proffered bowl. It held some type of white porridge. "But I'll survive." A silence fell, full of unasked questions. Fletch's brown eyes bore into her with obvious concern. The smoking steam from the hot bowl swirled in the brisk air. Fate met his gaze for as long as she could bear, then sheepishly looked away. "This place," she said quickly, determining to divert the conversation away from her injured body. "It's not the same cave." Fletch frowned at her slightly, but Fate defiantly took a bite of her porridge. It had a gritty consistency, possibly made of ground corn, and it had been garnished with salt and pepper. Fletch grunted softly. Edek found it during his hunt, and he thinks he found the entrance to the shrine. Fate coughed and spluttered on an overlarge spoonful of the hot grain porridge. "Are you serious? You found it?" she asked. Her eyes darted quickly to Edek. The drake had been laying so still that she had completely forgotten that he wasn't part of the cave floor. However, she could tell he had been listening intently to every word said. Edek's large eyes opened lazily. "Well, come on, let's move," Fate said, placing her half-eaten breakfast to the side. Her eyes darted from the drake to land on Prince Felix. "No. First, you eat," Fletch insisted. Fate was on the verge of arguing when her belly gave the most inopportune growl. Fletch grinned broadly, knowing he had won. Fate scowled back at him, but she took up her bowl of corn grits impatiently and tried to eat the steaming porridge quickly without burning herself. Fletch chuckled as he got to his feet. Fate thought she heard him say something under his breath about reckless and fiery, but she could not be sure. Fletch turned towards the entrance of the cave, and his smile faded. "It's uncertain how many wolves there were," he commented. "They might still be scouring the mountain for us. If they regroup, they may try to harry us again." "I'd welcome that," Edek growled fiercely. The sound echoed from the cave walls in a terrifying manner, and his talons dug into the floor as his paws constricted. "Quite so." Fletch looked grimly at the drake. "But we should avoid them if possible. Maybe we forced them off, or maybe we just made them mad." "I killed another," Fate said slowly. "Up where you found me. A big dark fellow. His body went over the cliff." Her voice had become strained. "He had that sword." She nodded towards Prince Felix. "Looks too fine for a common grunt. Maybe it was their commandant?" Fate finished in a recluse tone. Prince Felix opened his mouth to speak, but Fletch, seeing the haunted look on Fate's face, cut the prince off with a sharp glance. "Regardless, time is short," Fletch said quickly. "Felix, help me with Edek if you please. Then, with any luck, we can slip away." Fate ate as quick as she could. She desperately wished for a large glass of milk to help ease the coarse grain porridge. "Or perhaps butter?" she mused. Regardless, she proceeded to scrape every morsel from the wooden bowl and even licked the dregs for good measure. Now came the part she was dreading. Her small movements as she ate had foretold of worse things to come. She placed the empty bowl to the side and pushed up on her paws, trying to stand while ignoring the flame that seemed to erupt within her innards. She did manage to get to her feet by herself, but it made her dizzy with effort. Cautiously, she took a few steps towards where Edek was being saddled with all of the gear he usually wore. When Felix noticed her, he quickly made a move to help, but he was held back by a raised paw from Fate. She determinedly gritted her teeth, Foot by foot, she slowly made her way over the few paces that lay between her and them. Fletch watched her tensely, a coiled spring ready to leap at an instant. Determined, fate focused on her feet, and eventually she did reach Edek under her own power. Unfortunately, on the last step, her leg gave a wobble and she collapsed against his side, grasping at his protruding scales to catch herself before she fell. 2 sets of paws helped her as she pulled herself up and held tightly to the drake for support. Fletch was frowning again, creases etched deep across his forehead. That won't do at all.
I just need a tick. It's only stiffness,
Fate said nonchalantly, but her eyes told a different story and she grimaced.
It'll pass.
Edek's massive head swung around to observe Fate closely. It was a penetrating look that took in every aspect of her. Then he blinked and turned to Fletch.
Put her upon me,
he said.
What? No, Fate complained. I'll be too heavy for you to carry up and down half a mountain.
It's settled.
Edek's tone was set in that oh-so-stubborn pattern native to his kin, and as usual, it brokered no argument. Fate glanced helplessly at Fletch, who smiled a weak smile.
He's tough,
he said reassuringly, but we have to move quickly. Fate was deeply unhappy, but nodded in a resigned way. She did not like being a burden to anyone. After a quick discussion of method, Fletch and Prince Felix took various supplies off Edek's saddlebags, to be split between their own loads. Then they took out all the blankets and spare cloaks from the travel packs, along with a long tether of leather cord. Fate, unable to help in any meaningful way, maneuvered to Edek's head and stood, scratching the tender spots behind his jaws, and watched the others work. The blankets and cloaks they placed one upon the other, folding them into a thick padded square, which they placed between Edek's scaly shoulders. They passed the leather cord over and around his middle, cinching the material into place at the front and back as tightly as they could. Fate didn't think the cords would hurt Edek, but she did feel him exhale uncomfortably as they tightened the straps securely. "All right, up you get," Fletch said, glancing to Fate. Fate gave a reassuring pat to Edek, then worked her way down his long body, taking hold of the straps pulled tight across his middle. She pulled as Fletch and Prince Felix pushed, and she swung up into the makeshift saddle. The leather strap that wound around Edek's middle was the only thing she could reliably hold on to, so she gripped it tightly. The drake glanced back over his shoulder at her, then got to his feet. Fate gave an ungainly wobble as the drake shifted his weight. She let out a small hiss as the motion jarred her ribs uncomfortably. Fate gritted her teeth. She had a bad feeling the next few hours would not be a pleasant ride atop the large lizard. Edek walked slowly out of the mouth of the cave and into the bright sunlight of mid-morning. The air was brisk and sharp upon Fate's face. She pulled desperately at the hood of her cloak, trying to arrange it around her face while remaining seated upon Edek. However, the wind had other motives and stole the warm woolen whenever it could. A shuffling from inside the cave could be heard as Prince Felix and Fletch arranged the remaining gear onto their packs. Shouldering them, they joined Fate and Edek outside. "We found this where they took you," Fletch said, holding Fate's longbow ivy up to her. The inlaid silver scrollwork glinted in the sun, carved woodland patterns of vines about the grip, small flowers that curved along the belly, and thorns that crept down the limbs of the longbow towards the tips. "But I'm afraid the string might be ruined." Fate's eyes lit up as she reached down and took the weapon from him. She looked closely at the string.
"Yeah, it's thrashed."
She looped the bow around her shoulders, tying a quick and dirty knot with the remaining string to keep it in place.
"I wouldn't be able to draw it right now anyways,"
she said sourly, pressing hard at her middle.
"If there's blood to be had, I'll see to it,"
Edek said frankly. "No, you won't. You'll see her safe," Fletch corrected the drake sternly. Edek looked back at his charge, riding upon his back.
You speak true. No harm will befall her, I promise.
Fate leaned forward down the drake's long neck and spoke in a low whisper. I like your spunk. From deep within the drake's chest came a contented humming which made Fate's whole body vibrate. Fletch shook his head softly and looked up at Fate, offering her something. Fate held out her paw, and he dropped a few small chips of what looked like stripped tree bark wrapped with pale green leaves. Put one under your tongue, Fletch instructed. Fate looked at him suspiciously, then slowly placed one of the chips into her mouth. She gagged almost immediately. Ugh, that's horrible. Fate spit, trying to remove some of the stark, bitter taste. It's not supposed to taste good, Fletch sighed, looking at her seriously. But it should help with your ribs. Fate looked down at the small chips and mournfully shuffled them around in the palm of her paw. She glanced at Fletch and saw the concern in his face. She groaned and slowly raised one of the leafy chips to her mouth again. Ready for the bitter taste this time, she managed to keep herself from gagging and determinedly placed the chip under her tongue. She screwed up her face and tried hard to forget the horrible influx of bitter flavor suffusing her senses. After a few moments, the strong taste lessened, and she felt a strange, dull sensation take hold at the back of her skull. To her surprise, her ribs didn't seem to hurt as badly as before, but she did feel slightly lightheaded, as if awakening after a night with a bad cold. She put on a brave face and gave a muffled of acceptance towards Fletch. Replace it when they seem to be wearing off, Fletch said, and gave her knee a bracing shake. He turned and looked up at the sun-washed mountainside. Let's be off, and keep your guard up. Fletch leapt up a small incline of tumbled stone and headed toward the sheer cliffs in the distance. Prince Felix leapt nimbly up the incline after him, and Edek followed suit, clambering up the rocks with a powerful surge. Fate, atop the drake, held tightly as his quick movements shook her violently. His four-clawed paws hit at odd cadence as he traversed the incline, and his shuffling sent a shock of pain through Fate's middle as the drake landed on even ground. Thankfully, the pain did seem to be somewhat bearable, and suddenly any reservations she had had about Fletch's survival medication vanished completely. They progressed up the rocky passes of Viergnola. At first, Fate was determined to keep watch from her advantageous position atop Edek, but it became apparent very quickly that all she could really do was focus on not falling off the plunging drake. She held on tightly to the leather cord in front of her, but constantly had to shift her body position as the drake traversed rocks, down trees, inclines, and crevices, each obstacle seemingly destined to shake her fragile body with unrelenting cruelness. The wind was just as harsh, for it found every opportunity, usually when she was forced to reposition, to mischievously steal away her cloak and let out whatever warmth she had managed to trap away. Fate replaced the medicated chips under her tongue at regular intervals, but the pain in her sides slowly increased the longer she rode Edek. The strong taste of the bitter leaf and the slightly nauseous movement of the drake, scampering and clawing its way up the path, eventually reduced her into a miserable existence. She buried her face deep into the folds of the makeshift saddle. With her eyes closed tightly and teeth gritted, she willed herself not to lose her breakfast over the side of Edek. After an hour had passed, or perhaps it was two, Fate had a hard time keeping track of anything. Her whole world had dissolved into the shifting fabric a few inches from her face. When she did open an eye to peek beneath the hood of her cloak, she regretted it. The stabbing light was bright as it reflected off the speckled snow melting upon the passes. Fate vaguely recalled Fletch and Edek speaking a few times, but she was unable to comprehend what they said through the fog that seemed to have settled upon her brain. She had become numb all over from riding atop the drake. Her only awareness was that of the jarring, twisting movements from Edek beneath her, and the bitter taste of the leaf chips, which slowly lost their effectiveness. Fate tried to hold out as long as she could before she replaced the chip from under her tongue with a new one. In truth, It was a measure to delay the terrible bitter taste that would rush upon her senses. However, after a misguided step from Edek traversing the rough trail, the pain in her side would flare horribly, and she would be forced to relent for a new chip. Then the terrible cycle would start all over again. Meaningless time wore on until suddenly Edek came to a stop. It was not a momentary pause to find a better path, but a full-on stop. Fate lifted her head slightly and leaned over the side of the drake to weakly spit out the last medicated chip Fletch had given her. She raised her head to look around. "Look, there," Fletch exclaimed, pointing into the distance. Fate looked, squinting at the side of the rocky mountain, but whatever Fletch was indicating was still a mystery to her. The makeshift saddle rose and fell by degrees as Edek's side heaved up and down in great swelling breaths. She looked at the drake. His tongue lolled out of his mouth. A thick white foam lathered his maw. Edek could not speak. He merely licked his lips, and saliva and froth fell from his slack jaws to the snow below. He swallowed painfully and continued to pull in great heaving breaths as he slowly started forward again. Fate felt a great sadness for the stress she had levied against her friend. They pressed on, right up to the side of a steep rocky wall of the mountain. They continued following the wall, which slowly twisted its way further into the mountain until it became a narrow passage. Going single file, Fletch led the way deeper into the passage. Eventually, a dark shadow engulfed them. Fate looked up and saw the sky disappear as they passed underneath a stone arch cut from the living mountain. Words of the keeper's tongue were carved upon the dark stone arch, but in the shadowed light they were impossible to read. With a shock, Fate realized this was not the same place Fletch and she had visited with their master so many years before. Or was it? Something was different. Changed, somehow. But surely there could be no other shrines atop Viergnola with Lightkeeper runes adorning the entrance. Putting her misgivings aside, Fate said nothing as they continued moving through the passage. The air turned from a sharp sting of winter to a warm, heavy moisture. Edek's claws began to click loudly as the natural ground turned quickly to carven stone, as did the walls. Both surfaces spoke of expert craftsmanship and had been polished to a mere sheen. The passage before them twisted and turned. Then, without warning, the ceiling leapt far overhead. A great sprawling cavern stretched out before them. They all stopped and finally gazed in full upon the waters of Yulfron.
Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.